First of all, thanks for having me. I was saying I hadn't done the harmony before, but I have to say I was going to with a fun group. If I was listening to the description of bad interviews, I'm thinking through, yeah, I've seen a few of those, and hopefully I've never been one of those. So, topic today is big data. Just to warn you guys, a couple little sets. Number one, I tend to walk all over the place, and usually the mic may or may not pick me up. You can't hear anything that we repeat. Don't be shy. Also, sometimes if I get rolling, I may talk a little fast. So if you want to repeat something or have any questions, don't be shy. And as always, let us get a conversation, a presentation. So, even though I'm attending a professor of some universities, there's no need to raise your hand. This isn't school. We're all professionals here, so just, yell something out. It's almost like an insult or something. So, big data. Anybody here know what that means?
Bigger than small data?
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting point we'll get to in a little bit. The term big data is continually evolving. And so what big data means today is different than what it did 24 months ago. And what's going to be 24 months from now is probably going to be a little different. There are some key consistencies, but it's a moving target. And the other thing that's really cool about this a little bit is that when you ask, say, 5 people what big data means, you'll get anywhere from 4 to 6 different answers. And that wasn't a math problem because some people take different things. So start off with our questions for today are real simple. What is big data? How can we use in HR? And then where we go from here. Okay, real simple. Now, one question often is, how the heck does IO psychologists know about big data? That's a valid question. My background is really IO psychology, HR, professional development. My master's in industrial psychology. My doctor's technically in OD, although I teach at several universities in the psychology department, so I qualify as a psychologist in those states. And really, most of my background is the kind of stuff you guys are working in, which is how do we get that people component of the workforce, of the workplace, and make it effective and efficient. Well, the way I got, let's say, drafted into this is, one of the biggest training you get in graduate work, particularly in psychology, is a lot of training on data analysis. I've probably had about 6 semesters of graduate statistics over and over. So I can actually talk about really fun terms like eigenvalues, real cost of correlations, and factor analysis, and really things that most people make their eyes roll. But about grad school, I used to play poker with some guys, and they hated when we played poker because we started talking about the statistics on the poker table, and they'd say, "Oh my God, I can't talk to him." So they go real deep into that. With that, a lot of folks get really involved in things like scorecarding, analytics, and things of that nature. And back in 2007, I got, again, roped into the Hewlett-Packard, and at that point, I did some other consulting firms, to help build what they're going to have balanced scorecarding and analytics practice. So basically what it said is, take all this kind of data, make something that means to the business, figure out what you can do with it, and make something useful. And one of the guys who worked there with us, who showed me nameless, had claimed he had worked with Kaplan and Norton. You know who they are. They developed the balanced scorecard, the first bullshit in 1996, that first book. This guy was really impressive in the first hour to 90 minutes that you met him, and after that, it became really unimpressive. And as a result, that whole thing just kind of fell apart. And of the 7 or 8 folks who were brought in to help build that, 9 months later, I was one of the still employed in the Packard. Well, I was able to be employed was working in places like Booz Allen Accenture, 20 years consulting. I had learned how to do really useful things like manage a big project, whether it's strategy, IT, human capital, whatever. How to manage a project, how to manage people. So because of that, having a few folks that knew I could do that for previous jobs, I ended up about 4.5 years getting basically learning how to run an IT project, run the information management, business intelligence side, and ended up being the head of the business competency group, which had all the business consultants that were around part of the business intelligence group, and did all the business side of the business intelligence projects, which is what big data builds from. And because I had learned about things like ab initio and OLAP queues and extraction, transformation, and loading, and what a data warehouse is, and most importantly, that's kind of our response first on slide 2. Most importantly, I learned how to translate that into this really neat language called English, because most folks don't speak in those technical terms. And so a lot of what I'll say today is not a technical term, it's in a business term. And if we look at the technical terms, I'll tell you about them, But I have a funny feeling around this room, y'all probably don't care even more than I do. But they're there. So, does that make sense? That sound fair? Okay, cool. So, what is big data? And just to warn you, I pulled a bunch of these graphics off the internet, so I have no idea if I have right stream or not. You know, it's just Google something to make it down. So, yeah, I know, don't tell me. I love this graphic. And I'll tell you why. It has more big data in the middle and a bunch of stuff around it, and it's very confusing as to what the world is actually saying. And that pretty much defines big data. Again, we'll talk about a few things. We'll talk about velocity, variety, and volume as being the three things that qualify as big data. But other than that, I mean, you've got technology, you've got internet, analysis, research, volume, science, which science and lands, which you know what those are. You're looking at I am. Science, future, buildings. I can't make heads or tails of this thing, and I've been in the middle of it for a while. And that's the thing about big data is it's an evolving term, and you have to be able to filter through all that to understand what it means. So, what does big data mean? A couple of important things. First of all, this cube here. Cube. If you talk to business people about big data, they'll say, well, let's look at the OLAP cube. Okay. We'll look for a term together. An OLAP cube stands for online data processing. Or excuse me, online analytic processing. Excuse me. Why is it not just OAP as opposed to OLAP? I don't know, but that's what it is. When you get big data, the big thing you want to do is analyze it for insights. Okay? And anybody remember math where y equals the x and y axis? You know how you take like something goes up on y, if something goes up on y, it's moving on x. Okay. That's a two-tier thing, right? It's a 2x2 correlation. Imagine you go 3 of those, x, y, and z. Now imagine you go 8 or 10 of those. One of the things we'll talk about is one of the things you do in big data, and one of the things you do in analytics, is you'll do multivariate analysis and correlations to figure out all these different things relate, to figure out how to pull the value of your signal. We'll talk about some history a little bit. One of the clearest examples of this is there was a study published in 1998 by Reed and Associates. It's called the Sears Value Profit Chain Study. It's a Harvard Business Review. I want to say it was June of '98, but I might be mistaken on that. Basically, what they did is, and this is kind of one of the prototypes of big data, is they took all this information, threw it into a big honking database, ran statistics, and they found that at Sears, you all know this one, if you raise employee satisfaction by 5%, that will raise customer satisfaction by 2 to 3%, which results in a 0.5% increase in your bottom line. Now, some folks say, well, who cares about having a 0.5% increase in the bottom line? Think about how big Sears is, how much money goes through there. How much, that's, there's some zeros there, folks, so it's very important. So this is, again, all this data stuff here, you can see the handout. Another important thing here is about the structure and unstructured data sets. This is one of the really fun ones to talk about when we talk about IT people. IT people, when they talk about big data, they like what's called a structured data set. And what that means in non-IT terms is, you guys know like Excel spreadsheets, right? Okay. You know how you've got all the columns there defined, you know what's what. Supposedly all the columns are clean. So you have all the data in columns. That's called a structured data set. If you get a bunch of data and you don't know what it is or how it relates, that's an unstructured data set. IT people hate those. And there's this funny thing where they're all claiming that using unstructured data is a new thing. Now me, I was reading that questions too. Me as a psychologist, I say that's hogwash because we, as behavioral scientists, we've been using unstructured data for years. You guys heard of SAS or SPSS? Heard of those? Okay, these two big statistical programs are basically a whole bunch of data, throw it in there, and just mess around until you see something interesting. That's all unstructured data is. The structured data is where you've already done that, and then you put stuff into it because to see what comes out and make sure your predictions are true. That's all the differences are. And now you tell your IT people when they say we don't like unstructured data, they don't put it on. So have fun with that. So that's big data. This is what big data looks like to an IT person. You know what this means? Yeah, I don't either. I don't know the project this came from. This is IT stuff. Here's what it means to a business person. You take data, get information, get some knowledge, make some decisions. That's all that means. And again, the term big data we'll talk about just means more and more and more. We've gone from kilobytes to megabytes. Now most computers have something like 500 gigabytes, there's terabytes, and they're on petabytes, and now they're with zettabytes. And it's just, it gets bigger. And there's a thing called Moore's Law that talks about processing speed and network data. We'll talk about that. It's more and more building up as all there's to it. And all we're doing here is we're saying, as that data builds, we get more and more insights. Which again, going back to statistics, there's something like outside of basic stats. With statistics, the more data you have, the more confident you can be that the results are meaningful. So all we're doing is saying there's more and more stuff. Okay, so any questions on this so far?
I've heard a rule called the rule of large numbers.
Yep.
Is that kind of what we're talking about?
That's exactly what we're talking about.
The bigger the numbers, the better the results.
Right. For example, let's say we have, it's not just large numbers, we're representing numbers. So for example, let's say, the people in this room are all there is to the world. If I talk to everybody in here, I know that what feedback I give is really representative of it. Now, let's imagine that that each person here represents a million people. I could not talk to all, however many, 20 million people, but I can talk to a percentage, and statistically, when you get a certain number, I know that the chance of them being my representative goes down when I talk to them. And the larger that number gets, the lower that chance is of not being representative. And that's really all this gets to. So, yeah, I always laugh because when you talk to folks, they try to make it really complicated, but it's actually kind of simple. Any other questions? Okay. So, again, what define characteristics of big data? 3 things, which I should have used some different colors for this now. Look at this looks really cool on my laptop, but now it's not showing up. This up here says volume, that there's the velocity, that there's the volume. Did I just say that there? Oh man. My mother, who was a school teacher, will reach out to heaven and smack me for like popularity. This word says volume, this word says velocity, this word says volume. What it means is, we'll talk about why in a second. The volume, the variety, the velocity of the data that's being built up, again, law of large numbers, is ever increasing at an exponential rate. We'll talk about why in a second. And so big data is basically saying, let's take advantage of all that and gather more insights. Axiom, Mr. Stuart Conway, has basically made a whole lot of money. But you'll take all that data on household data and sell it to companies and say, you know what? We know that people who fit these categories are likely to do this. Because basically, again, basic behavioral science 101 and HR 101, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So all big data is getting more and more data about people's past behavior, particularly online, and then making questions. So, how much data? Why so much data? You know, I guess. Any thoughts as to why it's growing so exponentially right now? Anybody here got one of those? These tablets are the best thing to happen to big data in the history of time. Because, and I'll fully admit, I was a very late adopter of the iPad when it first came out. I was heard to say, quite frankly, in the discussion room, what's the point of this thing and what does it do that my computer doesn't? And now I love it around with it. Because the tablets are a great content consumption device. Laptops are good configuration devices, but tablets are great content consumption devices. You watch movies on them, or you read books. I sit there and I've got 2 little kids, and they always want to watch like Bubble Guppies and whatever the little kids show. I've got my Kindle out reading something that's not, it's not brainstorming, tapping over on doing it on my tablet. But whatever you read on your Kindle, they capture that somewhere. Whatever you buy from Amazon, they capture that somewhere. If you're browsing MicroStrategy, that's captured somewhere. Big Brother's watching, even though it's not as nefarious as something you're playing, but all that's captured. And all that's building the big data. And so these lovely little things right here are a big reason why the last 4 or 5 years, the amount of big data has grown exponentially. Things like Twitter, Facebook, and social networks. There's one IT company, I didn't show what their name was, but I'm not sure if it ever came to fruition, that's still working on it, was developing what they call a web crawler program that would go out, and the way they figured out where to market is they go look through some of the social networks and figure out if you were talking about their particular product or not. Yeah. It's out there. And so that's the reason why it grows so much. So, what does it all get done? It's captured in the cloud. You know what the cloud is? Yeah, a lot of other people don't know what the cloud is. Yeah? And that's what basically, in realistic terms, it's a bunch of servers off-site. But it's become this kind of nefarious term of, oh, it's the cloud, it's this magical thing. I was just telling over here a few years ago before the cloud first came out, myself and a buddy of mine who's now the CIO of, yes ma'am.
Would you use the microphone, please?
Microphone? How about now? Is that better?
We can't quite hear you.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay, no worries.
Thank you.
So myself and a buddy of mine who's now the CIO of one of the splits off, the two companies that split out, what do you call it, South Bay. We started joking a few years ago when the cloud first came out about we were referring to anything that involved mobile as pixie computing because of the small little phones. And we had to stop using this stuff. The cloud's the same way. Somebody a few years ago said this at a presentation at one of the conferences out on the West Coast. They said, oh, we're kind of like it's in the cloud, and it's stuck. That's all it is. But it's offsite servers, it's remote storage. Now there's a thing called Microsoft 360, where as opposed to you having your documents in the program resident on your hard drive, you have it you have it basically built in the cloud. Now, for someone like me who works on planes, sometimes that's really useless because, you know, if I can't get the internet, I can't work. But that's one thing they're driving towards. It's actually, if you guys remember mainframes, it's basically the same thing as a mainframe, as opposed to one company-based mainframe, it's like a world-based mainframe. So, but, what? You have a question? So it's, you know, again, that's all cloud is, and in the cloud's where a lot of big data is stored. And a lot of big data saying how do we go to the cloud, how do we use data. So, more and more and more. If you look at this is basically what happens per day. You've got, you know, something like 1,500 blog posts, 700,000 Facebook updates. At least $300,000 are spent on online shopping. I think that's got to be a low number. I know this someone I know very well spends more than that a day. 400,000 tweets. Let's see, 400,000 plus minutes of Skype phone calls. Now, I think that probably includes both the face-to-face Skype and like the Skype phones, a lot of times going to voice over IP text Skype phone. But all this stuff, like I said, it's all being captured. It's all big data. So, let's talk a little bit about how we can use this in HR. And I purposely selected this because this is like a big bunch of ones and zeros, and it's got this big gaping rabbit hole. And frankly, big data, if we aren't careful, it will take us down a big old rabbit hole we'll never get out of. One of the challenges with big data, and this is where HR folks and the strategic HR business partner comes into play, is when you get in these conversations, sometimes you'll have an exec go, yeah, I want to use some big data for that. And have no idea what the heck it means, or when their buddies say it. And then you as the HR person, you have to figure out a way to help them make the right decision. So hopefully this gives some insight. So big data in HR, let's start with that. So a little bit of history. Like I mentioned, first there was the Balanced Scorecard book back in '96 by Kaplan and Norton. And what that did is that really started a conversation of the way we evaluate a business needed to move from traditional accounting, where we only looked at what our financial outcomes were on a quarterly or monthly regular basis. So those were all lagging measures. And we, as businesses, as the world became faster, we look at leading measures in what drove those outcomes, not just the results. So that's what kind of started this whole conversation. There are a few things before that. That's what really popularized it. In 2002, again, Jack Fitzsimmons published a book called The ROI of Human Capital. If you don't have this book, and just so you know, I have no relation to this guy whatsoever. I get no money off of this, so this is not any advertising whatsoever. But if you don't have this book, go get it. I've literally worn 2 copies out just looking through it. Because it is so valuable. So what it does, it talks about how do we take all these human capital metrics, and how do we calculate that business value? And it has a lot of really useful stuff in there. I've seen a couple of videos of this guy talking, and I will say he reads much better than he speaks. But he is just, the book is brilliant about how you get this stuff out. And again, the more data we have, the more we can calculate, and blah, blah, numbers. And here's the book, this one's from this year, Predictive Analytics and Human Resources. I haven't got to finish this one yet, but really what it's talking about is, which we'll mention in a minute, big data is saying, all this data people lived in the past, we're going to take it up some models. From those models, we're going to figure out what we're going to do in the future. That's all there is to it. And the more data we have, the more confident our predictions are realistic. Because human behavior, if you understand what drives it, you have certain factors to figure out, you can usually predict about 8%. About 8% of the time you can predict what they're going to do. It's just like with personality assessments. If you properly manage, let's say, a person that not Myers-Briggs, let's say like a Berkman or a Neo or something, If you have that and you know what personality characteristics are required for a job, you can use it to predict how somebody's going to act in that job by 80% of the time. There's always the outliers, but you know what? 80% is better than 0%. So, but that's some basics there. Things to remember. Many people confuse big data and analytics. And if you ever have an exec that comes to you and says, I want to do some big data, I would ping you a little bit and say, are you talking about big data or are you talking about analytics? And the truth is in HR, given that we're focused on the company itself, we're more focused on analytics than we are true big data. Marketing folks and sales folks and product development folks, they're more that big data space. And we'll talk, there's some exceptions to that about things like recruiting and such, but for the most part, we're more focused on the analytics side with as much data as we can folks in our organization. Then we are going out and saying, let's get millions upon millions of tweets and figure out, are people liking our cookies? So it's key difference there. Like I said, this is velocity. And analytics is about taking the data to get useful business insights. It goes back to our little cube thing right there. So, anybody have a wild guess what kind of the granddaddy proto big data analytic is? I love asking this question. Anybody? Just throw something out. And not just for HR, just for in general, any kind of behavior. Big, the proto-analytic. It's one thing. All right, I'll give it to you. Credit score. What's your credit score? Your credit score is basically a report agent going out, gathering lots and lots of data on people, what they paid, what they haven't paid, what they paid over time, you know, the difference between, you know, credit, and trying to predict how much of a good credit risk you are based upon your behavior and how it matches to their model. You know, if you know anybody in the mortgage industry, they'll tell you what works to clean credit score 2 years ago will not work today. What works today will not work next year. Because they change those models all the time. They're always tweaking.
So in a case like this, though, you got 3 companies that are all using big data, they come up with different scores. That seems odd to me.
Well, that's because you're assuming rationality. What they do is, here's this again, that's a great point, I'm glad you brought that up. The scores will be different, but more than likely they should be within some variance close to. So you shouldn't have less like a 700 or 400. You might have like a 720 or 680, but you shouldn't have that great a variance. That's why I use all 3, because they all use different metrics. Well, these way they use different formulas. And those formulas come out different ways. They tweak them based on various statistical rules, what their data is, and you know, whoever's the head statistician that day kind of doing one of these, which are wind blows. There's different stuff. But it's that large data set concept used to make prediction. I always joke, I had a buddy of mine in college who, you know, like a lot of folks in college had a few credit cards and kind of didn't behave properly. And a few years later, he got a credit card from someone else. And had the nerve to call him and say, where's our money? And he goes, y'all ran my credit. I don't know why you thought I was going to pay you. It's, you know, yeah. I mean, I couldn't stop laughing when he said that because it was like, he's got a point. You know, because that behavior is, people and this is kind of that basic thing. Now, we also do this in HR. You know, if somebody performs low over a 6-month period, what makes you think they're going to do better tomorrow unless you do something different? You know, if you've got large amounts of data saying all of our sales reps, if they make 10 calls a week, they're going to do sales, but you've got somebody who's making 2, why do you think they're going to make sales? I'm always fascinated with people who get confused by that. It's, you know, it's logic mistakes. So that's, again, when you think about big data, just think about the credit score, how that works, and that's the prototype. And the thing is, now we have more data, so we know other things. So, a couple of examples. Anybody ever read this book or seen this crazy movie, Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill were in it? I haven't seen the movie, I want to part of the book. So, Moneyball is 2002 Oakland Athletics. They only had was like 41 million, excuse me, of payroll, which in baseball is not much. And just, you know, full disclosure, I'm not a big baseball fan, I'm a college football fan. So there's a lot of details here that I'm not that into. I mean, I'll watch my Washington Nationals in case watch the Cubs, and it's about it, but beyond that, I have no idea what's going on. I couldn't tell you who's losing today and who's not. But the Oakland Athletics, what they said is, they said, you know what, we don't have the money to go hire the big names. We can't go get Alex Rodriguez, we can't go get, you know, whomever. But what we can do is we can say, let's look at some metrics that others are looking at. Things like, first on base percentage as opposed to RBIs. We'll discuss it again. And let's find some folks who are undervalued but still contributing. And they found a bunch of guys who had done that, and they should have first in the division the next year. What they're doing is taking large sums of data, looking at it differently, another key point about analytics, and making decisions based on that. Now, interestingly enough, as soon as they did that, everyone else did it too. Which again goes back to, if we go back to this explains why those change all the time, because once you figure it out, somebody else is going to copy. Just accept it. So that's what I did here. Another good example. There's an article a while back called Robot Recruiting in The Economist. This, what they did is just some large data sets. It's going to evolve. You can Google this and stuff. And they looked at some big data sets and said, what are some interesting insights we can get, some non-intuitive insights we can get about the workforce. So number one, hourly workers who filled out their applications using Chrome, things like Chrome or Firefox, were more likely to perform better than those who use Internet Explorer. Interesting, huh? I don't know why. I mean, I thought maybe the fact that most of the time, most people who own their computers have use Chrome and Firefox, whereas if you have to go like an Internet cafe, most of those are Internet Explorer for some reason. I mean, I don't know what it is, but maybe more text again. I don't know. That was a interesting insight. Job hoppers were no more likely to quit quickly than those who make their job a long time. And that quickly is the main thing. We always in HR, if someone changes jobs, you always have to ask why. If someone's a job, as a consultant, you change jobs every 2 to 5 years. Sales guys, unless they start becoming a manager, they change every 1 to 2. So you have to look at it and say, are you changing jobs because you're being fired? Or are you changing jobs because you're progressing? Are you going from being a salesperson to a forklift operator to a waiter to walking on the street and asking for tips? Why are you doing that? The one that really kind of blows my mind is on the bottom that they found. They found that call center employees with a criminal record actually perform better than those without one. I think that says something about our call center status in this country. I'm not sure what it is, but it reminds me of that scene from the movie Good Morning Vietnam after they fire Robin Williams' character, and they're reading all the letters back to the colonel, and there's one very colorful statement that I won't repeat here, and the guy looks and says, "Sir, I don't know what that means, but I'm pretty sure it's bad." I don't know what this means, but I'm pretty sure it's bad. But again, that's one of the big things about this big data is if you look at it, you get some really neat non-intuitive insights. Because while we usually can predict what's going on, our qualitative assessment, it has our biases, it has our experience, it has our, we've had 5 people did X, maybe those 5 people were outliers, we don't know. We get those big data sets, we can figure out, again, the outliers and got lucky, or is anybody else like that? Another people was, there's a guy, Josh Burson, who's going to say, who's kind of become a big person in big data analytics. These actually didn't surprise me that much, actually. But things like, highly successful other things like no typos in the resume. I love when I show this to HR folks because they all kind of get really surprised. They're all kind of going, yeah. You show this to some MBAs, they will get really, really shocked. Because again, it's things like, things like where you went to school, what your grades were, don't matter squat. Did you get a degree? Or did you go to, if you go to Harvard and don't finish, you're more likely to be unsuccessful than if you went to, I don't know, classic tech and got your degree. Harvard did, you're also unsuccessful, excuse me, about that. So those are some useful insights. And they found that those who implement these things increase sales by $4 billion. So, again, sometimes we have to find the non-intuitive insights around. So, this right here, I don't know if this is detailed. Basically, I'm going to provide a PDF of the slides. You guys will look through it. We had Josh Burson, it's going to be called Burson Associates. They were recently bought by Deloitte end of last year. And he has this really neat 4-tier levels of talent analytics. And this applies to whether you're doing big data HR or whether you're doing data HR, doing analytics based on that data that you have in your company. The bottom level is reactive. This is just, your things like who filled out the time cards, who's, got their benefit stuff filled out, things like that. Next level is proactive. This is basically benchmarking decision making. So for example, if you know that those who fill out their time cards on time are the highest performers, are you benchmarking that? Are you tracking that internally? Next level is strategic. This is about taking some more advanced analysis. You know, this goes back to things like, you know, looking at who's actually doing what sales calls, who's, you know, showing on time. Trying to get a little more value after understanding how that behavior drives. The last one is predictive. This is where, this again gets into some really tricky things because some people say you can't do this legally, some folks say you can't, and it basically it's the whole, you know, because of the laws of your state. Where you take data that you know about people and use that to predict who's going to perform and who's not. And again, you know, if you have a call center, you know people that have criminal backgrounds perform better than those who don't. Do you go and actively look for folks with criminal backgrounds for your call center? I would recommend it, but no, it's a statistically valid idea. The other thing over here is statistically valid idea and good idea are not always the same thing.
As you go up this thing, though, cost-wise, what are the relations, the relative cost differences? I mean, predictive seems like it would be much more expensive to implement.
Oh, it's a ton more expensive.
Okay, that's an issue.
And the thing that it gets to is not just so much, there's two costs that occur. Cost one is the building of databases. Because basically, no, you're not going to run this on your laptop.
You're going to buy that kind of data, right?
Well, you can buy it too expensive, or if you're really crazy, you can go and stick a data warehouse appliance in your base and try to build it yourself. I don't recommend it, but you can do that. Where your real cost comes into play is labor cost. Statisticians ain't cheap. And really, to run this kind of stuff, you're getting folks who have at least a master's and not a PhD. And they're actually how to run things like R and Statistica and SPSS and SAS. And the problem is, there's a real evolving job title called data scientist. It's one of the hot job titles right now. And basically all that means is a fancy term for statisticians who don't want to be considered nerds and called statisticians.
Yeah, higher people skills.
Not some of the ones I've been. You know, there's a few years ago I worked for a company just prior to joining Hewlett Packard, and we were kind of the forefront of using analytics. And we had a statistician that we worked with who was also a PhD, a professor in his day job, and we had him part-time as a statistician on some consumer banks. And I remember telling my boss, I was like, Jerry, whatever you do, don't put this guy in front of a client. He's like, no, you're fine. Well, didn't listen to me. And the guy was, you know, and he was talking about the constant correlation and the R values and, you know, Spearman's Row. And I knew what he was talking about. All the folks in the audience were kind of looking at him going, no, what? Spearmint? Gum? I don't understand. No. It was actually a question somebody asked. And so, you know, a lot of those guys who are really good at stats, you know, I do that. I'm not the best stats person in the world. Okay, I'll freely admit there's people out there than me. But what I do a lot of times is see with people who are good stats people in the world and understand what the world they're talking about. So like someone like you guys or vice president of sales or something like that, and explain to them, okay, take off y'all loop down, here's what you can figure out. But again, those guys aren't cheap because they have basic ones to pay off and others. And they're actually this evolving thing where people will hire them just based on their stat skills and their people skills, and end up trying to job a lot because they realize this person doesn't make any sense. You know, I had a fire guy one time in a previous job because he literally sat there and insulted a client about their lack of statistical knowledge. Yeah. No, it's not. So, but yeah, also I think a lot. I will say for smaller organizations, what I actually recommend is don't try to do it yourself, outsource it. Because there are a lot of little shops, not too many around here, but a lot of shops in various places, what they'll do is they'll take you down for you, do this for you. And because you know, probably if you're a small shop, you'll need full time. If you're like a big pharma or Ford or something, you need full time. But if you know, say a couple hundred people, you can't go to the cost, just a few hours a week, outsource it. So, any other questions? All right. So, where do we go from here? I purposely put an elephant up here. That's the elephant podium. So, okay. So, what do we do? Well, we can figure out how to apply this to human capital. And what is human capital? Things like social recruitment, selection, training development, coaching and mentoring. You wouldn't think that data applies to coaching and mentoring, but it does. You want to figure out what your coaching program. Retainment. I always use retainment rather than whether they reduce turnover. Because one of the things you want to do with the analytics of the data is not just keep people, but keep the right people. I do a lot of change management work, and actually wrote a change management books here at Baltimore. And I always tell people we're trying to make change, say, you have to accept the fact that when we make this change, at least 10-20% of people are going to get mad and quit. And that's okay. Because you can replace them with those who like the new organization. Or when the organization evolves and you don't have those skills anymore. How many people still need COBOL programmers? How many people here remember what COBOL even is? Okay, that's better than most. That's why I don't like talking to millennials. They go, COBOL, and they're like, isn't that like a Greek god or something? I'm not supposed to do that. And of course, that's the knowledge management. Knowledge management is actually one place where big data becomes very, very useful, because what it allows us to do is you can track who's submitting what, how often they're submitting, what's submitted, who checks it out. Because knowledge management isn't just about sticking a bunch of stuff in SharePoint or Lotus Notes. It's about putting useful stuff on a SharePoint or Lotus Notes. We ever put a knowledge management system in place? One of the big problems is knowledge management, right? Just sticking stuff up in there. Is you either have one thing, either A, nobody uses it, nobody puts something up there, or B, people put every random, minute working document you've ever heard of up there, and it's completely cluttered and useless. So big data can analyze what's useful, what's not, and clean out what's not useful. A few level sets before that we should always do when looking at big data and human resources, or such like human capital, because we're not consuming resources of capital, we invest in no value. Big data is not the end-all, be-all of business decisions. Okay? I'm going to repeat that. It is not the end-all, be-all of business decisions. If you can't make good decisions off your little data, how are you going to make good decisions off your big data? It's kind of like little kids, and you say, well, they say, well, I want a bigger bike. You're like, you can't ride the one you've got. You've got to learn to make good decisions off the smaller sets. 2, we do not need to analyze everything under the sun to make good human capital decisions. Years ago, I got roped into this thing, and it's kind of being a place like Hewlett Packard and not being the IT guy, being the behavioral science guy. I got pulled into a bunch of conversations just because they didn't advise everything they're doing. And like you have 1 or 2 calls where I have to go, what's that? I had a client who wanted to literally take every piece of data they have on the people and run it through a big old statistical algorithm and see what correlated to what. And I was like, no. Because one, it's a waste of time and money, and 2, it might be illegal if you pull the wrong stuff. If you do some of the adverse impacts of picking group, you push some illegal out of it. It's the old saying about the sales of ice cream are highly correlated to murder rates. Do you not know that? There's a strong statistical relation between the sale of ice cream and the murder rate in every city in the country.
So if the murder rate goes up, more ice cream is sold,
or people eat ice cream for the murder rate.
So you eat too much ice cream, you murder more people.
No, actually what it is they both go up in the summertime when it's hot. Correlation does not necessarily mean causation. And one of the most important things you have to do with dealing with data is figure out, does it make any sense or not? We can't just, computers are great because they'll always do what you tell them to, not necessarily what you want them to. But we haven't reached the point of, we haven't reached singularity point yet of having artificial intelligence. And depending on what science fiction book you read, I hope we never do. Let's say science from next week or something. But we're not there yet, so we still have to make good business decisions. Last thing is, we do need to look for opportunities to integrate big data into our business decisions in the right way. And we want to get them integrated into our business strategies and our human capital strategies. Why? Good strategies drive it. So, what's a strategy? Well, I'm using this definition because it's from a book that I wrote, and like everybody else, I like my own stuff, and I can use it without people reading that and stealing their stuff. A strategy is a plan that creates a single competitive advantage to allow the organization to outperform their competitors over time, even in the face of a changing environment. Again, we talked about going all the way back to the credit scores. They change their models on a regular basis. Why? Because the environment changes. And we have to, when doing things like big data, change our modeling, change what we look at. We have to reevaluate. I always tell folks, you should reevaluate. It's like job descriptions, right? Who here doesn't redo their job descriptions on a regular basis? Thank you for admitting that. Most folks don't admit to that. But you have to update them. And I guarantee there's some of y'all here that don't just raise your hand. You should be assuming yourself not honest. I had a client one time that had a job description that was 42 years old. It had 2 lines. Line 1 said clean building. Line 2 said other duties as assigned. and that was not the worst line. But just like we update our job descriptions, like we update our policy manuals, like we update our benefits plans, we have to go through and make sure, does the design that we had yesterday still make sense today? Tomorrow, there'll be more data. Tomorrow, there'll probably be data points. 5 years ago, did we have Kindle apps that we could figure out who's reading what? 10 years ago, did we have, LinkedIn? Now you go to LinkedIn, if you want to pay them money, they'll tell you how many folks are pinging your website, your thing there, and you use it to help generate jobs. I want to get into Facebook. So you got to read the model. So what do we got? Well, first thing is, we got to figure out what the business strategy is. If you don't know what your business strategy is, then you should document, at least document what you're doing. Somebody in your organization should know, although I'm afraid if you don't. 2, document your human capital strategy. Your human capital strategy should align to your business strategy. I say should because one of the things that drives me nuts, but I also like it because it helps me pay my bills and avoid getting a real job, is a lot of companies do not have their human capital strategies aligned to their business strategies. I know companies that are sales driven, but the human capital strategy says something about empowerment or something. Well, empowerment's good, but if you're a sales driven organization, you need to be finding salespeople. Align those. Number 2 is inventory what data we have available. I'm talking about one of the easiest, simplest ways to do that. Go figure out what you have now. I guarantee you've got data available in your organization right now. It may be hidden in a bunch of spreadsheets on people's desktops. It may be in an Access database. Maybe you've got PeopleSoft or something installed. You've got data somewhere. The question is, where is it? How do you get it to a centralized location to do something useful with it? And that, again, is a whole different IT conversation. But you get it together, you normalize it, you make sure it's correct. I was listening to a while ago when I was at Accenture. One of my first jobs was with a big insurance company, big health insurance company, and they said, okay, your first thing to do is figure out how many corporate clients do we have. Not people, but how many companies do we have that are clients? Sounds simple, doesn't it? It took us 3 months to figure that out. Because in this list over here was one number, and this over here was another number, this over here was another number. Some of them had all the divisions, some of them had all the corporations, some of them had all the data. You have to know that. Next thing is identify what data we're going to need and don't have. Typically, I tell folks, do not even think about this until you get here. I will warn you, I have yet to be involved in a project related to data, or human capital, or data period, where you didn't have an executive that jumped in here. And typically, I would spend a lot of my time sitting there with them, explaining to them why you can't do that, while basically running interference, while everybody else is not doing what they have. And the reason why you don't want to do that is every organization, you may have data somewhere, but if you worry about that before you get that clear scope of what you have, you're going to waste time, you're going to waste money, you're going to waste effort. And as much as we like to think about it, unless you are, even if you are a not-for-profit, you still have a finite amount of money. We all have a finite amount of time. And amount of effort, and I guarantee you, folks working for you do not want to spend 24 hours a day on this. You may like their job, they must be telling their families, or watching sports, or playing ping pong, whatever their thing is. So you have to be really clear about that. Lastly, plan steps to close the gap. And that's where we get into things like project planning and Gantt charts and all that kind of stuff. So, develop a plan or analysis plan. Sorry, I missed one. The analysis plan, again, goes back to how do we analyze what are the statistics we use? Are we going to use correlations or regressions? And I would tell you very plainly, start small. I tell people, if you've never done any kind of big data analysis, the first thing you do is get your data cleaned up and just figure out what your averages and standard deviations are on all your metrics. Figure out what your average is. Simple as that. Once you get that, then you start worrying about, does A correlate to B? Does C correlate to E? And then you start doing regressions that predictive models. But again, crawl and walk before you try to run. Learn to ride your tricycle before you jump behind the wheel of that Ferrari. I've seen a lot of companies trying to jump in a Ferrari and crash it miserably. And consultants like that because it means more money for us to clean it up. But personally, I don't like to do that. I'd rather start you off that. So, how do you see the information you have now? Well, a lot of us have things like talent management systems, learning management systems, succession planning, 360 feedback, knowledge bases, all this kind of stuff. And just so you guys know, this is a partner of ours, so I use their stuff, and I have to reference a HR knowledge management system. And the guy that Chris, he's been a friend of 20 years, so if he gets some confusion stuff, I yell back at him. I know where you're But it's all there. You may have something like this, which is a cloud-based system. You may have SAP. You may have Excel. Whatever you got, just start off there. So, quick example. Any questions so far from this video? Okay. So, a quick example of using big data for this. A few years back, we had a client, and they had multiple facilities all over the country, and they felt they had a diversity issue. What is it? And for talking to what they really had was concerned about the percentages issue. They had a number of overall their non-white population in their facilities was less than 2%. And they said, we're worried about that. Well, here's what they didn't think about. They had stuff all over the country. They had stuff from New Orleans, in places like Memphis, all the way up to places like Wisconsin. Now, here's the thing about that. Having a small population, representativeness is geographically specific. So, for example, what a work population should look like geographically in some place like Memphis or Pine Bluff or New Orleans is way different than it should look like in rural Wisconsin. If you've got a 10% minority population in, say, Pine Bluff, you've probably got a problem. You've got in rural Wisconsin, you're probably reaching out. Because trust me, I did that whole state, and it's very homogeneous. So what we had to do was we looked at all their sites. We then pulled available census demographic data about what the local sites look like, and figured out where they really have a problem. Truth is that I think it was 10 sites, 8 of them were actually at or overrepresentative of the population. So they were doing pretty good. There were 2 had some real issues. With their hiring process, they weren't really doing anything that was disenfranchising or was illegal. But the recruiting practices, they weren't recruiting from the places where the non-white population was. And so we worked with them and say, you know what, let's look at where those folks are and then recruit from there. And so that's the case where so I'm going to be talking about the words up here. So that's how it's one place where we use big data to go some real clear, real specific, real common HR issue. So that's all my presentation. There's my comment. So, what questions do you guys have?
How small an employer would this become more than 5?
That's a good question. How small an employer has people issues?
50 employees?
Oh yeah, easily. I would say I probably would not look at smaller than 25, just because of the fact that at 25 and below, a lot of times, this is what I've seen, you're usually not capturing a lot of the things that you're doing it very, usually whoever is running that company has line of sight for folks working there. And so when you have line of sight, a lot of this becomes old. When you have to have 1 to 2 layers, at least 1 or 2 layers of management between the top decision maker and the bottom line folks, that's usually where you want to start looking at this. And then you can think as simple as not so much big data, but just scorecard data and analytics to say, you know what, on a daily, weekly basis, I'm going to have information about who processing and who does what sales calls are made, and building that up to where they can see it, and manage their company properly. As opposed to just saying, I'm going to wait, for a monthly report from the manager. It's just qualitative, like Bob and Joe and Joe really fine. So I'd say probably 25 or over 50, again, depending on the industry and what's happening, you know, you can probably get some traction out of this. What else you guys like to know? Really? All right. Well, thank you very much.